My name is Christopher Lawrence. Life has a tendency to bring many joys and sorrows throughout the years. This is a personal account of my relationship with Kevin Anthony Porter, whom I loved and spent many memorable years with. This is our journey of love. I came here because I was asked by a local medical doctor to come and join his practice as a medical technician, nutritional consultant. And when I got here, I kind of had second thoughts because I was used to being a big city boy, and I liked having a visible gay community and having, that kind of recognition in my community. And so I thought, well, I better go out and check out the community here and see what it's like. And so I went to one of the local nightclubs, and I was sort of surveying the territory. And across the room, these beautiful green eyes settled on me, and I was kind of amazed, even from across the smoky room. And it was crowded, and a few minutes later I looked over to see if he was still there, and he wasn't. And when I turned around, he was standing right next to me. And he introduced himself. He said, "I'm Kevin Anthony Porter." And I introduced myself. And after just a few minutes, we'd hardly been talking at all, he said, "And you should know, I'm HIV positive." It was kind of like a slap in the face. And I thought he was probably trying to tell me, now's the time to get out if you don't want to talk to me. And having worked in the AIDS community for, by that time, 15 years in San Francisco and Seattle, I was pretty aware that people are used to being marginalized and discriminated against because of the virus. This is especially true back in, 1991. So I just looked at him and paused and waited, like he was supposed to say something else. And then I said, "And your point?" And he said, "Well, I just thought you should know now." And I said, "Well, actually, I've been working in the AIDS community for a long time." And a strange look came over his face, and he said, "I've been praying to God for the last year that somebody would come into my life that knew about nutrition and the immune system and understood what AIDS was about." And I sort of felt like, well, maybe this is the reason that I came to Spokane. And I became more and more fond of him, and he became more and more loving, till we were spending practically every night together, and he was staying over a lot, and I was going over to his place. And everybody else thought we were already partners, and I kept telling him, "No, we're not partners." And then we went on this spiritual retreat, a workshop in Hawaii on the Big Island, a place called Kalani Hanua, a really beautiful place on the Big Island. And it was a workshop that was about self-exploration and about your spiritual self and how the different parts of yourself come together. And while we were there, a lot of things happened, actually. Anthony came down with his first illness, which was shingles. And he was ill for part of that week while we were there. And we had an exercise one night where we were supposed to write a letter to somebody we cared about who had made a difference in our lives. Actually, we had to write 2 letters. And so we each separated, all of us were writing our letters. And I was sitting alone and beginning to write. I realized that one of the people I was so appreciative of in my life had been Kevin Anthony. He had helped me learn so much about myself and helped expand my world. I learned to love animals from Anthony. It was just, I have no idea how I ever got to that point in my life without being absolutely in love with dogs and cats. And I was writing my letter, and I started writing about him. And the more I wrote the letter, the more I came to this incredible, astounding discovery that I was actually in love with him. I wasn't just loving him. And so I took this letter back, thinking I was going to give it to Kevin Anthony after the workshop, and no, that wasn't how it was supposed to be. The leader of the workshop made us read our letters to the rest of the group. So there I was in Hawaii, away from home, with Kevin, away from home, and I was declaring my love for him in front of all these people that we'd only known a short period of time. And I cried, and Kevin cried, and everybody there cried, because it was a wonderful unfolding, and it was an incredible discovery for me. I had been in such denial about how our relationship had been unfolding. And a few days later, he told me he'd made reservations for us at this Greek restaurant that he was very fond of. So we went to dinner, and I could tell he was very nervous all through dinner, so I knew something was up. And it was an August night, and it was warm, and after dinner, he was fidgeting, and after dinner we took a walk down to Riverfront Park where we'd gone on our first date. And we were talking about our future and things we wanted to do with our lives and what his dreams and aspirations were. He wanted to be a teacher. And he took me down by the waterfall, which, if you haven't seen the waterfalls in Spokane, there's a river that runs through Spokane that is just beautiful, and the waterfalls in the spring and the summer, even in late summer, are spectacular. And he took me down there, and with the full moon over his shoulder, he proposed to me in this beautiful isolated spot in the moonlight in the waterfall. And the way he chose to propose to me was to use words that would notify me of his intent. And he looked at me very sweetly and very seriously and very nervously, said, "Christopher, I have come to love you so dearly over the last year, and I want you to be my partner. Will you marry me and spend the rest of your life with me?" I still get goosebumps when I think of what he said to me, and I cried. Because when he said, spend the rest of my life with him, he was saying he was going to stay alive. We decided to get married on October 11th of 1992, which was National Coming Out Day. And we had our wedding ceremony at a beautiful place in Seattle. Half of our friends came from Seattle and half of them came from Spokane. And all the people from the retreat came from all around the world and all over the country. They had been there at the inception of our discovery of our relationship, and so they wanted to be there and support us. And I must say that coming down the aisle, as nervous as we were, with all those people around us who absolutely were loving us and supporting us, it felt like we were walking on air, like we were being lifted up. And for the first time, I got what marriage is really about and why you get married with all your friends around you. It's because they are there to cement this thing and to lift it up and venerate it. And it was such a wonderful and overwhelming experience.
The first time I saw Kevin Anthony, just before he and Christopher married, I thought, Christopher has really scored. This man is so handsome and so articulate. Christopher, of course, deserved that. And he brought such joy to him. And the finesse and the good taste that he had and the charm, I could see why Christopher was swept off his feet and was so in love with him. And I was glad for Christopher. I was happy that he had finally found the man of his dreams.
That next year, Anthony's HIV began to overtake him. We'd had the warning. The shingles are usually the first warning. And he came down with pneumocystis. Pneumocystis was really quite a challenge back then because it usually decimated somebody, and most people with AIDS died within a very short period of time. Pneumocystis is a form of pneumonia, and he went from 149 pounds to 117 pounds in less than 2 weeks as I watched him waste away with high fevers. And we knew that we were in for a battle. And I did my best to stay in my commitment because I had told him I would stick with him, and when I made my vows to him, I made them to God as well. And I made my vows to God about taking care of him as well as being his partner. And that was a very important thing to me. I had a lot of conviction around it, and it began to run my life and run me, which was fine. That was what I intended for it to do. So we struggled for many weeks with his pneumocystis, and we realized that we were in for quite a battle, and he was very weak. And we kept making our agreement fresh every day that I would be his energy and his power, and that he would rely on me if that's what he needed. And I would check in with him every day to make sure that he still wanted to be alive and that he still wanted to survive.
As he got ill, Christopher took on more and more a role of caregiver. And I never saw anyone put so much of himself into helping another human being. I know he loved Anthony, and he really gave so much of himself that I think it started to take a toll on Christopher, both emotionally and physically. He worked very hard to make sure that Kevin was eating right, and I think Kevin truly appreciated all that Christopher did for him. At the same time, when your partner becomes your caregiver, the relationship changes.
After Kevin Anthony was diagnosed with HIV, Christopher moved into that caretaking role that he does so well. What it did was it shifted the relationship from lover-lover to almost parent-child. And, I'd go over there and I'd see Christopher, prompting Kevin Anthony to take all his medications and eat right and do all the things that he could do because, of course, when you love someone, it's natural to fall into a role where you'll do anything to help him heal.
Over the next few years, he almost died 3 times. He came down with something called Mycobacterium in the avian complex, which is very similar to tuberculosis. And it's a bacteria that lives around us in the food and dirt, and he'd evidently picked up an infection of it while he was working in the garden. When your immune system is suppressed, you pick these things up. Even if you're taking medications to slow down the virus, your immune system is still suppressed. So he had this horrible, horrible infection, and it was in his blood and in his bone marrow, and he was getting fevers sometimes of 106. He'd go from 97 degrees to 106 in 20 minutes. So for weeks, I would have to wake up every 15 minutes and check his temperature, whether he was awake or not, and make sure that, because if his temperature went up to 106, I had to treat him with ice and alcohol rubs and get his temperature back down so that there wouldn't be any brain damage. There was one point where Kevin had an infection on his finger, and nobody could figure out what it was, so they kept just debriding the parts of the finger, and it kept growing and growing. And he was terrified during this time, just horrified that he was losing his finger, and it kept getting longer and longer, this part of infection. Over a period of a couple months, and he had several minor surgeries on it, until it was down to here, and there was an actual line of demarcation. And we were going to this doctor. He was a surgeon, plastic surgeon, and he was the one that we were referred to. And he was a good example of the kind of homophobia you still ran into, and AIDS phobia. He would stand against the wall with Anthony at the desk, or at the table, and he would say, "Okay, unwrap your finger and show it to me." He'd have him put it out. He'd have his assistant come in with rubber gloves and examine it, but he'd stand across the room and not even touch him. And we went through this, and I was furious. It was one of the times when I became pretty bitter about how people with AIDS get treated. And there were a number of different incidents we had, but that incident stands out the most in my mind, that this man who is supposed to be a lifesaver, and he would stand across the room and not even touch the person who was ill. It ended up being something that they could have diagnosed if they bothered to take a biopsy. It was herpes, and there's a medication for that. They ended up having to cut off his finger, amputated it, which broke his heart. He had beautiful handwriting, and it really affected his writing.
I was amazed by how driven Christopher was to be sure that Anthony survived his journey for as long as possible. At the time that they were going through their medication cocktails and all the things that they did for Anthony, the nutritional stuff and the alternative therapies, everything, Christopher taught me a lot about pulling all those different energies together, whether it was healing touch or whether it was nutrition or whether it was the doctor's visit or whatever it was. And that was a time when a lot of people were dying. And I was conditioned through working in a doctor's office where that was the big thing that we treated. I was conditioned to accept that people died and that the best thing you could do was give them quality of time that they had left rather than to try to make them get better, because in the end, nobody really got better. And so in my time with Christopher and Anthony, I learned a lot about expecting people to get better and not accepting that they wouldn't.
Kevin was really fortunate to be entered into a blind study, a cocktail for HIV. Half the people were given a placebo, and the other half were given this cocktail. It was very apparent very quickly that Kevin was getting well. He gained a lot of weight. He was feeling good. He had energy. It was just a whole new lease on life.
But the cocktails did make a difference, and the nutritional program we got him on that was very specific to his own blood work. His weight went from, I think it was hovering in the 120s to 130, up to 150, which is the highest he'd ever been, and then 155, and then 160, 165, and he actually started getting to be slightly plump. It was a good look on him after seeing him so wizened and so tired for so long.
I was happy to see that Anthony did so well on the drug cocktails, and we could again start to see the old Anthony come back that was more nourished and his body more supple and having more energy and muscles, everything. He just seemed to come back to life.
Well, it was really a miracle. I mean, he was gaining all this weight, feeling really great, didn't have any opportunistic diseases anymore, and he was literally yanked out of the jaws of death. And when this occurred, the relationship between Christopher and Kevin really changed.
Medications take a lot out of you. Even though they slow down the virus, they're a whole complicated issue in their own problems that come up and symptoms. And one of the things that happened was that they put him on testosterone, and he began to have personality change. And the personality change, some of it was good. He was a little more aggressive, which was good. He needed to be more assertive about his life, and he had been thinking about going back to school. But he had periods of what they call roid rage. Those were times when he would just flip out. He would get so angry. It would be like he was going insane. He'd be screaming at the top of his lungs. It would come from anywhere, and there was some paranoia that went along with it. He was getting too much, and the doses weren't being doled out well enough. They weren't being absorbed correctly. And this is often a problem when you get too much testosterone.
There kind of became a lot of rebellion on Kevin's part. And this led to the demise of their domestic relationship.
Over the course of Kevin Anthony getting better, the last time he really gained his strength, all of us saw that he was kind of breaking out of the mold, that he was no longer wanting to be seen as the identified patient. And in a love relationship like that, it's really hard when you get locked into a pattern of caretaking patient. And I think Kevin Anthony really wanted to break out and be seen as a whole man now. You know, I'm a new person. And as I said, sometimes those patterns are really hard to break once you get into them. And so he didn't want to be seen as the patient anymore. I think, he didn't think he was going to be around, and all of a sudden he realized, boy, I've got a new life, and what am I going to do with it? And so unless there's a lot of counseling or therapy around separating from those patterns and recreating a new, loving, passionate type of relationship, those patterns are almost impossible to break.
So at this point, Anthony was really working hard to reestablish his individual identity, and I know that he was feeling trapped. Our relationship was beginning to suffer because I couldn't seem to pull myself out of the role of caregiver and parent, which I had to take because he was too weak for me to be just a partner. And he wasn't willing to have me do that anymore, even though he wasn't quite ready and strong enough to take responsibility for doing all the things and remembering to do everything he needed to stay healthy.
Several times Anthony called me late, and he had been
they'd had an argument, and he was a little upset about how to deal with things. And then Christopher would call me, and we'd go to lunch and talk, and he was upset about how things were going. And it was kind of like they were both in an impasse, and they couldn't get past their feelings of who was hurt the most, or I don't know. They were both reaching out, I think, for support and maybe for answers or somebody to guide them back to each other, and I don't think they could find that within themselves.
Things began to change for us. We got a little more distant. At one point, he moved into the other bedroom, and we separated our lives that much. I still was the one who took care of him when he was sick, because he had bouts of sickness all the time. His energy wasn't good enough that he could just go to school constantly and have any extra energy. But we still loved each other. We still cared about each other. He just needed some changes. And at some point, I realized that he was beginning to see other people. He was going out by himself, and he started seeing other people. And that was a really hard time for us. Was really more of a hard time for me because I just refused to let go. I had made my commitments, and I had stuck by them. And here was a wonderful man who had pretty much died 3 times. I mean, he was so ill that it was almost like he died. He'd made his peace and then come back, and he wanted a chance to really live his life again. He didn't want to be held down. He wanted to have exciting things happen to him. And that's kind of what happened. Of course, there were feelings of resentment and anger. I was very angry that he'd moved into the other bedroom. I was very frightened. I was frightened in a couple of ways. I was frightened that I was losing him as my partner. I was desperately in love with him. I was frightened that I would lose him as a human being because he wouldn't take good enough care of himself in his newly found independence. I mean, I understood on one hand that he really needed to be independent. He needed to be able to make choices for himself. He'd been all but dead for months and years. He had no decisions to make on his own without my helping him make them. So I did understand that on some levels. Of course, I didn't like it. I didn't feel good about it. I felt horrible about it. I was angry at him and resentful, as I said. At some point, I realized that I had become codependent, and I had become so enmeshed with him that I didn't really have my own personality anymore. I'd lost my individuation, and that's what he was looking for, was his own individuation. It's kind of like a child leaving its parent, learning how to be their own human being again. So he was getting another chance, and I realized that I needed to be getting another chance too. And just about that time, I got sick.
Christopher got very sick and actually ended up having a liver transplant. I believe that the years that he took care of Kevin took their toll on him, as I said before, both emotionally and physically. Kevin really showed no interest in Christopher's illness. He didn't seem to want to know about it. He certainly didn't ask about him. He didn't ask if he could do anything. He never really wanted to know. I think that was really it. I believe that Kevin had been through so much and had been so sick himself. He had somewhat gotten back on his feet. He had started a new life in Seattle, and I believe he just wanted to forget about it all.
They have so few livers to give out, so few organs to be transplanted, that you really have to be almost ready to die within days or weeks before they can give you a transplant. And about this time, Anthony met somebody who was really important in his life, somebody who had only been out for a short period of time, didn't really know the gay scene, was fairly naive, didn't really understand AIDS, but really recognized the beauty in Anthony, not just his looks, but the beauty within him, the kind of human being he was. And he and Anthony decided to be partners. But during that time, I continued to communicate with Anthony. He didn't come and see me in the hospital. I'm not even sure that I let anybody tell him that I was in the hospital at that time, because I was still hurting so much. Although I was pretty much okay with the fact that he'd moved out. I was very clear that he couldn't have been around while I was that ill. He would have been of no help, and I would have been worrying about him. Truthfully, I was attempting to be stoic. I really was still feeling abandoned, and I was very confused. My mind was already confused from the illness, and so I never got to completely process everything during that year and a half between the time he left and the time I actually had the surgery. And I think not only was I feeling that he didn't have the ability to take care of me the way I'd taken care of him, but I still was resentful and angry. I definitely hadn't gotten to the point of forgiving him yet. That was to come later. After the surgery, I was completely present. My mind was back. I still had a lot of confusion, a lot of pain. It was excruciating pain for several weeks afterwards, and a lot of emotional pain as I began to deal with my feelings about Anthony as well. So I was recovering both from the surgery and pretty much coming back from dying, starting my life over understanding that now I didn't have a partner. And I think I learned a lot during that time. I figured out a lot and processed a lot. I could see where Anthony came from, having gone through such trauma in his life, why he changed the way his focus was in the world in some ways. I could certainly understand how our relationship had become so enmeshed that we weren't really just partners anymore. And that was the crux of it all. Anthony needed to feel independent, and I certainly had that feeling myself during my recovery, wanting to be strong and my own person again instead of relying on everyone else to take care of me. So I had a rather sad insight into what was going on with Anthony, and that was part of the process. A little over a year ago, I wasn't getting any emails back from Anthony, and they were bouncing back. So I put a call into Steve, his partner, and he told me they'd been in the hospital for some time. They'd come back from France, where he'd finally gotten his master's in French and in history.
When we got back from France in August and then the early part of September of 2003, I noticed that Anthony had grown very tired and was spending a lot of time lying down and resting. And I didn't know at the time, and he wasn't diagnosed yet, but in a couple weeks thereafter, the latter part of September, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was about the middle of October of 2003 that Anthony did go into the hospital and left our home at that point. Anthony began to talk to me during those last few weeks, and it was hard for me to understand that the end was coming. I never really wanted to believe that, and I really truly believed that he would pull out of this, just as he'd done many, many times before. And when he finally shared with me during the week of Thanksgiving there in November of 2003 that he felt like the end was coming, I had to start resolving in my own mind and heart that this truly might be the end.
And I visited them. And it became very clear to me within a couple of days that this time Anthony wasn't going to make it. And I had long discussions into the night with Stephen to tell him, what their choices were, and I had long discussions with Anthony. And at one point, Anthony, he just broke down and started crying when we were alone. And he said, "I'm so sorry for the way I treated you and for all the things I said and I did. I didn't mean it, and I love you so much, and I love you for everything you did for me, and I always told my family how good you were to me and how well you took care of me." And I cried, and I held him, and I told him that I didn't have to forgive him. I'd already done it, because he was asking for my forgiveness, and that I had already put all that behind me. And that as far as I was concerned, I just loved him dearly, and I was so glad that he had been part of my life and imbued so many characteristics and helped me turn into a man instead of the boy I was when I met him. And that was a real healing. It was a real transformation for both of us. He needed to let go of that pain that he was holding from the pain he'd created. And I really did need the affirmation that he cared about me and that he recognized my commitment to him all that time. So I was thankful for that.
In order to heal one's heart in this situation with Kevin Anthony and Christopher, Kevin took his wings and he flew. And Christopher, I think, had a period of mourning and sadness over that, because he'd done all of this to help his partner, recreate his life. And I think there was a period of time where Christopher needed to grieve, needed to go through that mourning, and then release it through forgiveness.
A lot of my friends didn't understand why I wanted to forgive Anthony. Truthfully, he'd done some pretty horrible things to me. But as I began to realize the anger that I was feeling was really doing me more damage than it was anyone else, he'd begun to rebuild his life, and I realized it was time for me to do the same thing. So, despite some of my friends' feelings, I began to work on understanding where he was coming from and working with my own higher power about what it meant. And I had a new perspective because of the surgery and because of coming so close to death. And that was that whatever time I had left was so incredibly precious, so incredibly auspicious. The gift is that we really don't know how much time we have, how many moments we have, how many seconds we have at any given time in our life. And you don't really own that until you come close enough to death in such a way that it impacts you powerfully. So when I would look at Anthony and feel badly about the way our relationship was crushed and destroyed, I began to rebuild the relationship, remembering what my vows were, to love him and honor him and take care of him. And in my own mind, what I did was I just continued to communicate with him. When he needed something from me, I would just talk to him lovingly and reminding myself that this was the man who proposed to me, who took me into his heart and reminded me what a great human being I was. So the choice was mine. I could either fill my mind and my heart with feelings that were positive and remind myself of the love that I do receive from those I love, including Anthony, or I could let my mind be taken over by hatred and resentment and anger. And I really couldn't see why I'd want to spend my time, whatever little amount I might have left, with those emotions that only destroy me. And that was where a sort of epiphany came for me. And I had an experience where I really was able to let go and just love Anthony for who he was and know that he had changed my life for the better in so many ways. So many ways that I didn't have to hate, I didn't have to resent, I didn't have to be angry anymore.
Many friends stopped by to visit Anthony, and it was a very wonderful time for his family too, to share final thoughts. I think everybody in the back of their mind didn't really want to accept this, that it might be the end, but I think we all knew that it was getting very, very close. Christopher called and asked me if I would visit Anthony in the hospital. I said, okay. And I didn't ask any questions. I just said, okay. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't want to go to visit Anthony. I still harbored such resentment for his leaving Christopher in the first place. I discovered standing there at the foot of his bed in the hospital that my flowers were really not just from Christopher, but they were from me to a man obviously dying. We were pretending he wasn't, though. He was much too young to really be dying. And I wanted to be there. now for myself. And I didn't know much better, but I realized that Christopher had forgiven him and released him to be in a new life, but that life was ending anyway.
And I have to say that I lived kind of in a fog at that point because so much happened so fast. But Anthony was very, very aware and cognizant right up to the end. On Saturday evening of November 29th, it was an evening where all the family had just gathered around his bed, and he was sleeping as he had done so often the weeks prior to that. And a chaplain there, Bailey Boucher, had come in, and we sat down to just share and started telling some stories about Anthony's life. And we started telling some stories of when he had gone over to France and some of the funny things that had happened. And I looked over, I had been holding his hand, and I looked over, and it was about 7 p.m. at that point. And at that point he had passed away, and we all realized it. And we just stopped for a minute, and the chaplain kind of brought us to begin singing a song. And we all began singing this song together. And I can just remember the peace that was settling over all of us. And Anthony's face was very, very peaceful at that point as he lay there.
When Kevin died, we were singing On Eagle's Wings, and that happens to be one of our very favorite songs. I miss him. John has a laugh, and when he laughs, sometimes it reminds me of Anthony's laugh. And he was such a, I don't know, he just had such a great sense of humor, and we had shared lots of laughs together. And when I think of him, I think about how tender-hearted he was.
Curtis had been my best friend for most of my life. And so I asked him to be there with Anthony and Steve and his family in my stead. And I felt like I was there with him spiritually. I was. He was my representative. And he was a wonderful man to do such a thing for me. I knew what his feelings were. And I had to be in Spokane. It just wasn't appropriate for me to be there while some members of his family were there. It was a time for them to be alone and have their healing, and I had my goodbyes and my closure with Anthony. And I waited for the phone call. And it finally came, and I knew what it was when the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Curtis to tell me that Anthony had passed away right after Thanksgiving. And I was sad. I was very sad, and I was relieved. He was in so much pain at the end, and he had suffered so many times, the 3 times the doctors had thought he was going to die. You don't just lose a person with AIDS all at once. You lose them in parts. You're with them while they lose parts of themselves. He lost his finger. He lost his vision. He lost most of his friends. He lost his ability to be independent for a long time. Even after he left, he still couldn't be completely independent. And his life and his death impacted me in ways that I can never fully measure. But he impacted me more than any other single human being in my life.
I'm just going to say that when I was around Kevin, the times that we were together, there was a warmth and specialness about it. He would always give me a big hug and a kiss, and I always felt very close to him in that way. And I always just felt like I had a very loving brother.
I guess that if I was asked if I would go back and do this whole thing over again, I would, because of all the people that I've loved so much, and the time that I've spent with them was so precious to me. But it's so hard to think of the AIDS HIV, the whole journey that people go through is devastating to them, to their bodies and their spirits and their families and the community in general. And it's been like going through a war.
Most people of my generation can't talk about AIDS because they're dead, like Anthony is. They passed away. And what people need to understand today is that AIDS is not like diabetes. It's not just a simple disease that you can control. The medications that are out for AIDS, they slow down the process, but it doesn't kill the virus. And AIDS isn't an illness of its own. It simply invites all these other illnesses in. Every one of them can kill you. But the medications themselves have such side effects that you don't know if the symptoms are coming from the virus and the breakdown of your body, or from the side effects of the medications themselves and the breakdown of your body. At any rate, there's going to be a breakdown of the body. People need to understand this is not a virus that's just going away. This is an illness that you can protect yourself from. 70% of the people who have HIV don't know they have it. So if you're counting on somebody telling you they have HIV before you sleep with them, you're making a big mistake. You need to protect yourself.